Hey, I'm Stephanie, and welcome to Wine Club. This is a playlist where I drink good wine while I whine about bad books. I'm gonna apologize ahead of time. There's some screaming child outside my window at the neighbor's house across the street. Don't know what's going on there, but if you hear it, so sorry. The kid is alive, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't be screaming. But we are here to talk about today's offender for Wine Club, which is unfortunately The Bones of the Story by Carol Goodman. Goodman is an author I have read before, and I remember liking her work, so this was kind of a surprise that I did not end up liking this. I also want to give a warning that there are going to be spoilers and shit talking in this review. If that is not your varietal, you're probably not going to like this video. Now, if you do want a spoiler-free version of this review, please check out my What I Read in February video. And I also want to say that this review is solely about the work and not about the author as a person. I'm sure Goodman is a lovely human being. But let's go ahead and see what this book promised to be about. When a dead body is found on their college campus, a group of former classmates discover that it wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. It's been 25 years since the shocking disappearance of a student and the distinguished creative writing professor who died while searching for her. The Briarwood College community has never forgotten the terrible storm that caused the double tragedy. Now, the college is bringing together faculty, donors, and alumni to honor the victims. On a cold December weekend after the fall semester has ended, guests gather on the vacant campus for the commemoratory event. But as a winter storm descends, people begin to depart, leaving a group of alumni. Recriminations and old rivalries flare as they recall the writing projects they shared as classmates, including chilling horror stories they each wrote about their greatest fears. When an alumna dies in a way shockingly similar to the story she wrote, and then another succumbs to a similar fate, they realize someone has decided at long last to avenge the crimes of the past. Will the secret of what they did 25 years ago be revealed? Will any of them be alive at the end of the weekend to find out? So, like I do say in my spoiler-free version of this review, I really struggled getting into this. I know that stories are supposed to start in media res and we get dropped right into things, and because that's how life is. But I was very overwhelmed being dropped into this particular story. There is a giant cast of characters that I never really got to know or felt like I could really keep straight because a lot of them are very similar. There's relationships and conflicts between these characters that I just didn't understand. And I hate to say it, but the setting really failed to hold my interest. Like, this is a smaller liberal arts school, I think. Like, this college is old, I think. Has a lot of culty traditions. I think I never really understood it. And for the life of me, I could not picture this setting. I had absolutely no idea what this school looked like, how it was laid out, the different buildings, like the dorms, like I had no clue. Could not picture this thing. Now, I will say I do really like that all the things did line up really well in the end. And I do think Goodman did a really good job of plotting this. But the plot was also very overwhelming and boring at the same time. Like, the idea of this is so great, but the execution falls short because I think it's trying to do so much. So we follow Nell, or Ellen, just because Nell is Ellen spelled backwards, who in the present timeline, because this is still told in a dual timeline, Nell is right now the dean of this college, and in the then timeline, she was still a student who kind of feels like an imposter. Her family doesn't come from a lot of money. She got into this school on a scholarship, whereas everyone else kind of seems like old money, probably like New Yorkers, like very East Coast elite. So Nell just doesn't feel like she really fits in because even with her scholarship, her mom can barely cover the cost of like any extra tuition or like her books or like the room and board. So Nell really falls under the spell of her roommate Lane and wants to be just like her. Lane comes from money. She is very secure in her lot in life. Nell is extremely jealous that no matter what, Lane will always have a safety net, and that she herself cannot do the same things that Lane gets to get away with. Lane is just very self-assured because she can be. But the more we see of Lane in the past, it really made me question a lot of things. She is arrogant and popular, and now she can be charming when she wants to be, and she knows how to win people over and manipulate them so that everyone is basically fawning over her. But again, she's very manipulative, and like her closest friends seem to know this about her. So like, why are they still friends with her? Because like a lot of them in the then timeline, like, I can't deal with Lane right now, or oh, I don't want to do this, or oh, Lane's kind of the worst. Then stop hanging out with her? Like, I don't know, feels like a pretty easy solution. Because like by the time of the end of the then timeline, I just really couldn't understand why anyone in this group was still so enamored with her. They're waiting for her to show up for this commemoration event, and they're all talking about how excited they are to see her. But why? Like, I don't get it. So the story does kick off with the commemoration of Professor Moss, who is the teacher that died at school 25 years ago, the same night another student went missing. And at this point, that missing student is just presumed to be dead. So Professor Moss ran this like writing society and seminar. Again, I'm gonna be honest, there were so many things going on that like I could never figure out if this like Raven Society was different than the senior seminar that was taught by Moss. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but there was a lot to keep track of in this. So to honor Moss's legacy, they're bringing a new live-in writer to work with the students and help them with their writing. This character, Hotch, who is the president of the school, but he was the dean in the then timeline. Hotch really wants Lane to become this writer in residence because after she graduated and left the school, she became a very well-known author, even though she stole her story. But she's very famous, very popular, so Hotch really wants her, but she is making everyone wait for her to grace them with her presence. Yeah, Lane was the most successful after they all left school, even though she's also pretty much a recluse and cut herself off from everyone. People have not talked to her in 25 years. Do you see where this might be going? But she did reply yes to this event and is supposedly coming. So at first they think she hasn't shown up because this winter storm blows into town, and all the people from the Raven Society or that senior seminar are there, again, 25 years later after they finish school. Nell is trying to keep the peace as all the former alumni all have beef with each other and a lot of shared history, which comes out to be kind of a dark shared history. So Lane doesn't ever show up, so Hotch ends up offering the position to one of their former classmates, Miranda, who gleefully accepts and starts treating everyone around her like absolute trash. Nell's executive assistant, Ruth, basically gets the brunt of this terrible treatment, and I'm amazed that Miranda never thought, like, Ruth's gonna spit in this tea that you are requesting, like, she's gonna put some weird stuff in your food, lady, like, you could try being a little nicer. But this also leads to my first big issue with the book. Ruth is always, like, hissing things, or she's mad about something, or just generally acting either really shady or supremely pissed off. Basically made me wonder if the girl had like permanent PMS, because she is just angry about everything. She's a little ball of negative energy. I guess it takes one to know one. But again, since she's always hissing at people and going around being super angry, I immediately knew that she was up to something. So at this point, it's more just figuring out her motivation for why she's doing the stuff she's doing, instead of who is doing this stuff. And honestly, I'm kind of amazed that Nell never noticed how Ruth can like barely contain her disdain for all the returning students. Everything Ruth does is very sus, and yet it's supposed to be a big reveal in the end when she's the bad guy. It wasn't. So come to find out that Ruth was also there in the then timeline, but she wasn't called Ruth. Her name was Bridget. Bridget is the student that also went missing the same night that Professor Moss died. And Bridget hates everybody. And she hates everybody now too, but she really hated Lane, Nell, and their little group of friends. And she was not shy about letting people know of her hatred. She even wrote a story to get into this Raven Society, basically about getting revenge on this group of popular kids and what she would do to torment and torture them. Like, girl, I think maybe you need to see a therapist instead of working on your book with Professor Moss. Now, I will say the reason that Nell doesn't immediately clock Ruth as Bridget is because Nell thinks that Bridget died the same night as Moss. Like, they saw Bridget fall into some, crevice or cave on this mountain near the school, and they kind of presume that she just died. Obviously, her desire for revenge stopped the bleeding head wound that she had, and she was able to claw her way out of the snow and vowed to make everyone pay for leaving her dead, and basically screwing her over in the first place. See, Ruth wanted to be in the senior seminar too, but Moss only accepted so many students, and one night Nell sneaks into the office where the submissions are being held and switches out Bridget's story so that Lane could get a spot. Ruth does not know this. I guess Ruth and Bridget don't know that it was Nell who did this to her. She thought it was somebody else in their group because she saw that person also sneak into the office that night to check that she had made it in. So Ruth just assumes that, yes, she obviously secured a spot and then somebody kicked her out or swapped her place with somebody else's and that they did not deserve it. Ruth has basically been nursing this revenge for years and years and years, and finally has her chance with all the students coming back for this anniversary to enact that revenge. And so she starts using the stories that they wrote in school about their worst fears and uses it against them. She takes Miranda's life by pushing her down the stairs, poisons another character with cyanide, tries to electrocute another person, and basically tries to bring their nightmares to life. But she ain't no Freddy Krueger. Because honestly, that was probably another big disappointment with this read. Like, the whole bringing these horror stories to life sounded so amazing. I was so excited to see that. It's like that much of the book. Like, it really ramps up really quickly, so we get a few of those scenes, but it's not spaced out, and it's not really enacting this sense of dread that I think was a really big missed opportunity. Anywho, we come to find out that Lane also fell into a cave, or was potentially pushed, and she actually did die that night. It was Bridget / Ruth who took over Lane's life. As she found Lane, she saw that she had died. So she skipped out of town, packed all of Lane's stuff up, and just pretended like, she left the school, she's done. So she went ahead and published her work, which was actually Nell's story that Lane stole from her, and made it seem like Lane is still alive. Like, she was still paying her bills, checking her email. That's how she replied yes to coming to this event. Lane has been gone for more than 2 decades. How no one figured this out before now makes no sense. But again, it doesn't really matter. Which leads me to my next issue with this. Nothing matters because there's just so much going on. There are so many little things that detract from the overall story. We've got to keep track of all of these characters' backstories and who they are now. There's a lot of mentions of ghost stories and urban legends, and Nell is constantly seeing this scary figure running around, and there's a lot of the school's traditions to remember. And again, the biggest letdown is the idea that the characters are supposed to be dying one by one based on the stories that they wrote in school. It kind of does happen, but it's, again, not really a big part of the plot. I wanted it to be a much bigger story. I wanted to see them writing these stories in the then timeline and what scares them so much about it, to then have it set up when it starts actually happening. Oh, yes, fill me with that dread. I really wanted to hear more about these stories in the past and see them play out. But it's not really what we get. Even the past timeline is more devoted to Nell obsessively wondering what Lane is doing and what's, how's Lane gonna help her when they get out of here? I don't care. We also spend a lot of time on this love triangle, or I guess maybe a square. I don't know. It's between this guy Ben, who ends up becoming a cop who's investigating all of this stuff because he stayed in town. Got Nell, our main girl, this guy Truman, who is a writer in their group, and Lane. In the then timeline, Truman is Lane's boyfriend, who Nell has a massive crush on. And she's not very subtle about it because pretty much everyone seems to know. Ben has a massive crush on Nell. But I don't care about the stupid love triangle. It doesn't add anything to the story. And in the end, Nell and Truman get together and have a happily ever after. Like, I guess fuck Ben then. In fact, this whole love story is taking away from the bigger story by being yet another thing that I have to keep track of. There was no need for a romance subplot in this type of story. Strip all of that away and spend more time on the scary stories coming to life to haunt them that is Bridget's revenge. That is the crux of the story here. That is the piece I wanted to see come to life. I did not expect this Nell Truman Ben romance to be such a big plot. And then of course they're basically having a pissing contest over Nell in the present timeline. Which I don't care. So I already mentioned that there's like this mention of like urban legends and these paranormal stories. So this book also spends a lot of time on Nell talking about this story that she wrote, which is basically about her going to the school and seeing a changeling of sorts that she calls Blur Girl. And Blur Girl is trying to take over the main character's like life. And this inclusion is more distracting than it is symbolic. And that ends up being the story that Lane steals and then Bridget turns that into like her published novel, which again, like, screw you, Lane. And Nell never even calls her on it. Like, Nell, I beg you, grow a spine. And everyone in this Raven Society knows that that was Nell's idea and her story, but they're all just kind of okay with Lane stealing it. And even worse, Lane tries to get Nell in trouble at school as Lane, they're roommates. So Nell wakes up one morning and Lane is like flipping through the pages that Nell wrote and is basically like, did I give you this idea? Because in theory, it's a good idea for the story. So Lane's very jealous and basically tries to plant these seeds of like, oh, I must have talked about this. And then she quickly runs to her room, types up another draft that is eerily similar, submits it first, so then that way Nell gets in trouble for plagiarizing Lane's story, which was plagiarized off of Nell's story. Nell is very aware that she's being manipulated, but does not leave Lane in the dust. Like, girl. I'm also pretty annoyed with this book because it commits a writing sin that I hate, where it's written in first-person point of view. And so Nell has to like talk in circles or purposely avoid saying names as to not spoil a reveal later. Stop it. If you can't write in first person because you need them to like jump through hoops to get around saying something, just write the story in third. So annoying. I mean, the sad thing is, again, the bones of this story are good, but they get covered in meaningless crap and details that it kind of just became bad. I really do think that the book was trying to do too much. Had it been simplified, used way fewer symbols, and honestly reduced the cast a bit, this would have been a much stronger story. There's just too much going on, and the story tends to flounder under all these like subplots and shared histories. For kind of a small book, this is far too complex. It does not need to be this complicated. It can be a lot more simple, and it would be a much better read if it was. The way it is, it made for a very slow and tedious read. I lost focus a lot while reading this, and I did not really care for any of the characters. They all kind of suck. Like, when it comes time for, like, the stories that they wrote about their, like, horrors, and when that part's supposed to, like, come to life and bite the writers in the ass, we speed right past those scenes, and they're all, like, chunked together. That idea is what sold me on this book, and it plays such a small role because we spend so much time on other inane stuff that I don't care about. I don't care about the love triangle. Again, I think this book had so much promise, but the story, I think, it just got away from Goodman. There are other locked room murder mysteries with, like, a winter setting, because that was another thing. I loved that it was going to be like, oh, we're locked in because of a snowstorm, and oh, there's a killer among us. I guess. There are better stories out there than this. I ended up giving this 2.5 out of 5 stars. It's not the worst thing I've read, but this could have been so much better with some revisions and killing of Goodman's darlings. There's a lot going on here that, again, could have been saved for a different story, or let's trim it down a little bit to tell a more cohesive, simplified, and structured story. Okay, the idea is so solid. It's just the execution gets wrapped up in so much other crap. If you do have any recommendations for good wintertime locked room murder mysteries, please share your recommendations in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for joining me at Wine Club.